Hi everybody. So I have a lot to talk about in this video, so I can't promise that it's going to be short, but I will do the best I can to kind of move as quickly as I can. I have some notes written down that I kind of want to go over to talk about Beloved. So yesterday I went through and graded most of the discussion boards that were based on Beloved. So I think I did like 3.4, 3.5, maybe 3.6 or something like that. So I got to get a really good sense of what you guys were thinking so far. So I just want to say right now, my talking points right now, or my little mini lecture, is going to be based on the whole novel. So if you haven't finished it yet and you don't want spoilers, then I recommend that you stop watching this and finish the book first. So like I said, I'm going to refer back to some of the questions that you guys had about the book, but I am going to talk about the ending too. So I will say, if you're really struggling with this novel, and I understand if that's the case, that it may be a good idea to just get the spoilers out of the way now, because the ending actually is kind of confusing. So it might be in your best interest to listen to me now and then finish it. If you're not worried about the spoiler effect, if you just kind of want to understand what's up, that's an option. So let me go to a couple of major questions that I felt like you guys had. So I asked you in one of the discussion boards to write a question to Toni Morrison, which is always a fun exercise. You know, Toni Morrison passed away just last year, so we're not really obviously speaking to her directly, but it is interesting to think about, like, if, you know, it's a real person who wrote this, and what kind of questions does she open up for us in our reading of her book. So a lot of the people being you guys, on that discussion board were saying, had questions about style. So you guys were like, why does it go back and forth in time? Why does it jump around characters? Why is it so confusing? And I am right there with you. So this is the third or maybe the fourth time I've read this book, I think. And I still, in this copy, I've read the same copy every time, I still have like moments with question marks where I'm like, what's going on right here, or what's being referred to? There are moments throughout this whole reading that I like had epiphanies about this time, on the third or fourth time through, that I never understood at first. So I just want to preface my conversation right now to say, this is kind of like one of the things that happens when you start really reading literature. And it's that when you read a text or view a text or whatever you're looking at for the first time, you can go ahead and expect to not get it. You can expect to get some of it, but you can go ahead and expect that your first viewing or reading of anything is going to come with a lot of gaps. And that is just natural. I have to remind myself of that in my PhD program right now. I'll be reading like a really famous scholar, and I'll be like, I don't really get this. And my teachers are like, don't worry, you don't get it because it's the first time you've read it. So a lot of these things take a couple of visits to get through, especially a book like Beloved. Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize in 1987, and Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize for this book. So those kinds of signals should tell you that this is like not your everyday beach read. It's like really established in like the literary world as something that's really important. And when something is really important, unfortunately, usually it's not really easy. It's a little difficult. So I'm hoping that in my conversation that I'm having with you today, that I can help unpack some of those confusing things. But when you finish this class, even if you write your paper on Beloved, just expect that you still don't get all of it, but you're trying to grasp a thread. You know, that's why I teach this with tropes. So maybe you can kind of understand how your trope is being sort of talked about. For me, I wrote about this a couple of times. I wrote a paper about this and Equiano together when I was in graduate school, and my whole paper was about memory. So all I was thinking about with this book was about memory and like community narrative. So thinking about how Equiano, and y'all read this too, how he was a voice for a larger group. I think about Beloved too, in its actual relationships, relationship to community, Beloveds and Sethas. So we learn here at the end that the community comes in and saves Setha and Denver, but they have a tension with those people before that. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but because I was thinking about community and memory, that's kind of all I focused on when I read this book the first couple of times. This time, rereading it for y'all, I was like, this book's about gender. You know, last time I didn't even think about gender, but now it was all that was in my mind was looking at Paul D and his, you know, like struggles with being masculine. And the last line that he says in this book to Setha is, only Setha could have left him his manhood like that, which refers to her not mentioning, his bad memories. So he is constantly just aware of masculinity, but that I didn't pay attention to the first time. So I'm rambling a little bit here, but I just want to comfort you a little bit to say, grab onto a trope, grab onto one through thread that you feel kind of confident that you sort of could understand, and then know that this book is always going to be here for you to come back to it if you ever want. And, the more you read, the easier it is to read. So if you read some more books that are kind of like this, then you come back to Beloved, you'll be like, oh, all this stuff is clicking for me. So, okay, now I'm going to actually start. So one of the main questions that you guys had to Toni Morrison was, why is it so confusing? And I want to actually draw your attention to the preface or the foreword of this book. Now, I don't know that your copy has a foreword, so I didn't really mention it as an assigned reading. I don't know which edition you ended up getting, and I didn't want to cause confusion, but the foreword is where she talks about how her coming across that story of Margaret Garner, who was a slave woman who, just like Setha, escaped the plantation on which she worked and then ended up murdering her children in response to being found. So it's the same narrative. Not exactly the same, like we don't know her kids' names and we don't know if there was a Paul D or a Baby Suggs or all that stuff, but like the main point about her killing her children, or killing at least one of them, is what inspired this novel, Beloved. So let's jump into the end of this. If you have the book, you can go ahead and pick it up. At the end of her foreword, after talking about her inspiration for the novel, Toni Morrison says, I wanted the reader to be kidnapped, thrown ruthlessly into an alien environment as the first step into the shared experience with the book's population, just as the characters were snatched from one place to another, from any place to another, without preparation or defense. A little down later, she said, in trying to make the slave experience intimate, I hope the sense of things being both under control and out of control would be persuasive throughout, that the order and quietude of everyday life would be violently disrupted by the chaos of the needy dead, so that the Herculean effort to forget would be threatened by memory desperate to stay alive. So let me kind of interpret what I think she's meaning when she says this. Obviously, the first part kind of makes sense. The disoriented nature of the character's experience is reflected in the writing style. So in the same way that we are pushed and pulled into different perspectives and different places, so too were these characters. So that makes a lot of sense. That helps us understand kind of the jumping around. But I think there's something extra about the jumping around in time that many of you made note of. So this novel continues to jump back and forth between Sweet Home, memories of Sweet Home, and the present, with being in 124. Oh, sorry, I now have a kitty in my background. But so the past at Sweet Home, the present in 124, and then something in between, which is where Setha escaped and where she commits the murder of Beloved and tries to kill her other children. So it's actually kind of 3 scenes that we go back and forth between. And I believe my interpretation of that choice is to show that interconnectedness of past and present, to show the way that, we're in a present moment, but we are still in the past in some ways. We're deeply affected by what Setha calls her rememory. She's constantly having to remember those moments of her past, the trauma, and because they are so effective, they're part of her daily, present moment. She talks about when Paul D comes, that all she had thought about before he showed up was the past, and now he kind of gave her this sort of thought about the future, which was crazy to her. She'd not even thought about future because all her present is entrenched in the past. So in reading a novel that does not start at the beginning and end at the end, it kind of starts somewhere in the middle and then constantly goes back, I think Toni Morrison really is trying to drive home that point, that our past is part of our moment. And that's a big conversation just now historically, and if you've been around for the past month or two, we have we're having lots of national conversations about Black Lives Matter and what do we do about the relationship between law enforcement and the tendency towards abuse of power in some cases. We've seen without a doubt that's been kind of a factor in our society. And, you know, some people are really against the idea that, you know, slavery, because it was so long ago, a lot of people emphasize that, you know, that's in the past, you know, that's part of America's past, you know, we should be, you know, not even thinking about race as a problem anymore. People aren't racist anymore. We don't have slavery anymore. A lot of people think like that. But then on the other hand, a lot of people have a counter argument where it's like, well, I know slavery isn't over, but look what happened after slavery with Reconstruction, and some of those things were kind of sketchy. And then look what happened with Jim Crow laws, and look at how it was just 1960 that those were kind of gotten rid of. And, you know, what are we still dealing with the past in the present? Can we let go of the past and pretend like it doesn't affect us in the moment? So Toni Morrison would say no, just unapologetically. Even Denver, who never lived at Sweet Home, gosh, where y'all are getting like a acrobat show with my cat back there. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do with her. Anyway, Toni Morrison makes the case that not only is Setha and Paul D, not only are they people who are on Sweet Home still affected by it, but Denver, who wasn't even ever there, she was born like not on the plantation. She was born in like the middle place where she's escaping. She's still affected by the trauma of her heritage. So whether or not you disagree or agree with whatever's going on in the current moment politically, what this novel is really trying to get across from Toni Morrison's point of view is that we actually cannot escape our pasts like we wish we could. So it's a little bleak. That's why this class is themed horror and terror. Like, that's kind of terrifying to think that, you know, your past can affect your present so much, but that's one of the major themes, and it's reflected through the narrative style. So let me jump to my next point, because I'm really taking too long to explain all this. But I mentioned a little bit about gender roles already, and I want to talk a little bit about another question that many of you had, which dealt with morality. So there were a couple of people on the discussion board who, I'm not going to say were judgy, but some of y'all were a little judgy about Setha. Some of you were saying, why does she act like it's okay to, like, how is it okay that she killed her child? Like, some of you had no sort of sympathy for that act and saw it just as totally immoral because it's murder. And I can understand that in the real world. If someone today in 2020, did what Setha did to Beloved, I think we would all be like, whoa, that lady's crazy. And that's what the community does in Beloved too, even the 1800s. They reject her from her choice. But the novel complicates the morality of the choice. It forces us to think about Setha not as a monster. It forces us to think about her as kind of the hero. I'm going to give you a couple passages that maybe will help you understand a little bit about what the book is wanting us to think. The book wants us to kind of, again, release judgment and sort of instead think about the choice that she had to make because of the situation she was in. Let me go to page 193. This is where one of the quotes I wanted to pull from. So after, the second half of the book, things start clicking into place because we finally get the narrative where the 4 horsemen show up and we finally know for sure that Setha kills Beloved. Before that, it's a little confusing. She talks about it in circles because she's so traumatized. But we eventually get to like a place where we understand, okay, yeah, she did this. And she tries to kind of explain herself to Paul D and to herself. So when Paul D finds out that Setha had killed, I think this is what she's talking about here. Yeah, when he finds out that Setha had done this because Stamp Page shows him the news report, it gets kind of like Setha tries to narrativize her choice. So let me say what she says here on page 193. She says, I stopped him, she said, staring at the place where the fence used to be. I took him and put my babies where they'd be safe. And when she is saying, I stopped him, I put my babies where they would be safe, she's talking about murdering them. Later on down, Paul D thinks about Setha's talking about safety with a handsaw. He says her love is too thick. She says too thick, and she says love is or it ain't. Thin love ain't love at all. He said, yeah, it didn't work, did it? Did it work? And she said, it worked. Paul D is like, how? Your boy's gone, you don't know where. One girl dead, the other won't leave the yard. How did it work? And she says, they ain't at Sweet Home. School teacher ain't got him. And he said, maybe there's worse. Like, maybe killing them is like worse than them going back to the plantation. But Setha's perspective is this: it ain't my job to know what's worse. It's my job to know what is. And to keep them from what I know is terrible. I did that. And Paula Dee says, what you did was wrong. And she says, I should have gone back there, taken my babies back there. He said, there could have been some other way. What way? He has no option for her. Instead, he kind of calls her an animal. He says, you have 2 feet, Setha, not 4. And she, really harps on that. He counted my feet, she says over and over, because she feels judged by him. But, some of us were kind of in that Paula Dee position, too, in our discussion. We were like, why'd you do that? Couldn't there have been some other way? According to Setha's perspective, absolutely not. Think about all the trauma she narrates having gone through. She's like, this isn't going to happen to my daughters or sons. So I would rather them not go back. I would rather them die than go back to that place. And, this is part of long legacy, and this is kind of touchy, but I will just say this is part of, I think, speaking to a legacy of suicide and slavery. So if you just do a little research, it's easy to find that, Equiano talks about the Middle Passage, and I think he talks about people, maybe not in the section that you guys read, but he talks about people jumping off the ship rather than go through the Middle Passage to be slaves. And it is not uncommon either to read accounts of people who were being held as slaves killing themselves so that they wouldn't have to continue living the life that they were in. So, there's something, and this is touchy, and please just hear me out here. There's something really striking about these situations that draw attention to death and agency. Agency means being in control of yourself. So I get to make my own choices because I'm a free agent. I'm able to choose where I work or where I live or, what I have for breakfast. I make those choices. So I have agency. That's kind of what Setha is doing in the committing of murder. She is exerting her agency over the situation. She is saying, I'm in control here. And so I know that it's morally wrong. You're hearing me say that. Murder is wrong. Don't mistake me, or don't take my words out of context there. For sure, bad. Suicide, not lots of other choices. And if this is a thing you struggle with, obviously there's so many places you could go to talk to people on campus, and even me, if you had something you needed to, all that stuff is very complex and very dark and very deep and very real. But this novel is trying to complicate those things even further by saying, in this moment, can you imagine a moment that's so terrible that murder actually is better? Can you imagine a situation that's so real and dark and hopeless that this is actually the choice? And like I said, we have historical records where people made that choice too. So I think she's trying to draw attention to that. So I just want to say, try to take a little bit of your, I don't know how to say that. Try not to feel so morally judgmental towards the character, and instead kind of think about the context of the situation. You can still think she made the wrong choice, but the novel really is just asking us to understand the choice rather than judge the yes or no, right or wrong. So yeah, understanding, but not, necessarily judging. She does ask for forgiveness for it later. I will say that's on 284 if you're wanting some page numbers to kind of help yourself refer back to some things. Also had something that she said on 236, just to kind of nail the point home. She said, this is her narrating to herself, by the way. So I will say, I didn't mention this with the narrative perspective and the craziness therein, but as soon as the novel tells us about the 4 horsemen and Setha killing Beloved officially, Setha begins to speak in first person prose, using I. And that's a big sign too. There's some freedom in unwrapping the truth for her. Her confession, though she doesn't really confess, though it gets her, the revelation, I guess, or the revealing of her story, gives her agency to speak again. So that's another tricky thing that Toni Morrison does with the narrative perspective. But in that passage, at 236, one of those moments, she says, why I did it. How if I hadn't killed her, she would have died, and that is something I could not bear to happen to her. So hear this. How if I hadn't killed her, she would have died. She reads her killing her as saving her from death, which is confusing, but you can understand. There's a different kind of death that would have occurred had Setha allowed her children to go back to where she came from. So I hope those passages kind of help bring some of that back together for you. I got 2 more points, and I've already been talking for 20 minutes. I hope you've got me on like speed, like 2 times fast or something to listen to, because I know this is getting long, but I really know that this book is hard, and I just want to tell you some things that I think help make it a little bit better. So I do want to talk about the representations of whiteness in this novel. So we have a few white characters. Some of them are horrible, some of them are okay. Let's look first at someone who's pretty horrible, and it's 176. This is the 4 horsemen passage I keep referring to, I think. And it's on 176. Yeah. So the 4 horsemen passage, I think, is really interesting if you want to talk about a narrative perspective a little bit more, but that the men who come for Setha after she's escaped narrate that scene. They talk about what they see happening. Setha doesn't have to, again, confess. Instead, her story gets told to us from some pretty asshole people. That's basically what happens. So we're looking at the bottom of 176 here. So I want to just talk about what the men come in. They come to get Setha. They go in the shed and see that she's cut the neck of Beloved. So the nephew, the one who had nursed her while his brother held her down, didn't know he was shaking. His uncle warned him against that kind of confusion, but the warnings didn't seem to be taking. What'd she go and do that for? On account of a beating? Hell, he'd been beat 1,000,000 times and he was white. Once it hurt so bad and made him so mad he smashed the well bucket. Another time he took it out on Samson. A few tossed rocks was all. But no beating ever made him, no way he could have. What'd she go and do that for? And this is what he asked the sheriff, who was standing there amazed like the rest of them, but not shaking. He was swallowing hard over and over. What'd she go and do that for? He says it 3 times. And this nephew is the one who caused more trauma for Setha than anybody, the one who nursed her. You've heard her talk about this from like page 3, it feels like. She's been like, they took my milk. They did all these other things, but the thing is, they took my milk. She always goes back to that. And he doesn't understand from his perspective. He at no way understands what he's done. And in fact, says, well, I've had bad stuff happen to me too, but I didn't do that. I don't even know how to comment on that. His perspective is, I've had a hard life. I didn't kill my kids. I think we can all agree, the characters in this story, that the nephew has probably not had as hard of a life as Setha. She's been totally broken. Her whole back is just destroyed. She's been raped. She's been nursed. She's lost her husband. She's had no agency, to go back to that word about control, for her entire existence. This nephew has had probably some bad things happen to him, for sure, but not this. So he's not able to empathize with Setha at all. And instead he goes to his own moments to say, well, I didn't act like that. Look how much, and I'm white, she deserved the things that she got, is sort of his mentality. So it's kind of condemning of slaveholders, for sure, this novel is. And I think we can all agree that's probably an okay thing to do, to say, like, look at how kind of ignorant this guy is. But the other complicated thing about this novel is that it doesn't just have big white villains. Like, it's a little bit confusing with the Garners in particular. So this is on page 260. And this is towards the end of the novel where Paul D is thinking back on Sixo's death and reflecting on his time and his manhood, as always. But this really stood out to me when I was rereading this passage a couple days ago. Paul D is thinking back to Sweet Home, and he says, he wondered how much difference there really was before school teacher and after. Garner called and announced them men, but only on Sweet Home and by his leave. Remember, Garner actually let the guys, the Pauls and Sixo, learn to read, and Hal, they all get they get treated like men, they say over and over, and he stands up for them constantly. When he dies, school teacher comes in and is the really abusive one. But Paul D is like, even though school teacher was beating the shit out of us and Mr. Garner was treating us like men, were they really all that different? He says a little bit later on down, Garner called and announced them men, but only on Sweet Home. Was he naming what he saw or creating what he did not? That was the wonder of Sixo and even Hal, and it was always clear to Paul D that these were two men, whether Garner said so or not. It troubled him concerning his own manhood. He could not satisfy himself on that point. He did manly things, but was that Garner's gift or was it his own will? What would have been without Sweet Home, without Garner, whatever? He recognizes that, yes, Garner does allow him some agency, but is that real agency if somebody has to bequeath it to you and they can take it away even with their death? And then two, are things even so different when you have a good person, Garner's, and a bad person, school teacher, if they're both in control of you, if you're owned in any case? Do you see what I'm saying? Even if they're like a good dude, but he owns you, it's just as bad, is what Paul D is kind of coming to a revelation. So again, it's sort of another condemnation of, how do you say this? Of being sort of good, but not good enough. Like standing up for, like Mr. Garner stands up for the men and Setha, but he doesn't let them go free. He's not an abolitionist. He doesn't fight for their equality. He makes them free or men on his plantation, but not in the real world. So it's like, it reminds me of like the Bible verse that's like, if you're lukewarm, God just spits you out. I don't know if y'all know that verse. Like, it's a one people use all the time, but it's kind of what she's saying too about this, like standing up against the oppression. If you're not gonna go all the way for it, you're all kind of just bad, like school teacher and the Garners. So one last point here. This has gone on for way too long, but again, hopefully it helps. The last point I want to make is about community. So, I mentioned just very briefly, and I'm going to make this so quick, but, when Setha does commit the murder, she is ostracized. She's cut out. Her community is like, we're done with you. Bye. But they come back around in the end. And I want to draw your attention to why. One reason is Denver. She goes out to Mrs. Jones and is like, we need help. But there's another character named Ella. And her narrative, and it's real easy to skip over this because I know you're almost at the end and you're like, how's this going to end? And you go kind of fast. But I want you guys to go back and remind yourself who Ella is. And she's a woman in the community. And it says in this passage towards the end of 301, it was Ella more than anyone who convinced the others that rescue was in order. So they had three different groups of people: those who believed the worst, those who believed none of it, and those like Ella who thought it through. And so Ella's like, she says on page 302, she didn't like the idea of past errors taking possession of the present. What's happening here, if you've read, is that Beloved has just started engorging herself. She gets fat and looks pregnant, and Setha is just being depleted and slowly like dying essentially. And that's when this like exorcism happens. If you want to think about the ghost story, the women come in and they're like, we have to get this ghost baby out of here so that Setha can live. Her past has to be ripped from her. And so what really, I want to just point this out, what really makes Ella convinced that they should do this is on the top of 305. Ella was the one who, she talks about she had been kept in I'm not sure where, I don't remember if it says clearly, but she's kept as like a sex slave for this father and son, and they constantly abuse her. And she remembers on page, I'm sorry, that's so graphic and awful, but she talks about Ella, that she actually gave birth to a baby because of the abuse. And she talked about, on 305, she delivered but would not nurse, a hairy white thing fathered by the lowest yet. It lived 5 days never making a sound. The idea of that pup coming back to whip her, too, set her jaw working. She remembers on 305 that she had a baby that she did not nurse. Therefore, it died. So therefore, she murdered a baby too. And I think that is something, it's like I said, easy to read over, but it's kind of the whole key to the novel. What really connects these people in the end is their empathy. Their tying of stories together. They're connecting to one another. It's the same with Paul D and Setha too. Their sharing of memory, their sharing of story, and seeing similarities is what gets Beloved out of there. Beloved takes off running at the end. We don't really know where she goes or if she'll be back, but there is some sense of closure, I think, with her, being sort of the exorcist of her. She's kind of gone, and it happens because someone else said, hey, I went through something like that too, and is willing to like bring other people in to kind of help. Okay, those are my main points. I did not mean for this to be 30 minutes, but I hope that, you know, at least some of this is going to help you connect to the novel a little bit more. So with that being said, I'm going to post this video. I've posted a lot of content for you. I went ahead and posted for the next 2 weeks because I know I was a little behind on getting this one ready. So I even extended a couple due dates to make sure you have time for everything. You don't have to write this response paper on Beloved that's coming up. You'll see. You get to choose it's the same prompt as last time, but you get to choose between Get Out, Equiano, and Beloved. But Beloved will be on the final exam. I'm going to talk about the final exam soon in the next couple weeks. It's a multiple choice short answer and quick essay prompt that is actually a pretty easy final exam. My students usually talk about it being, you know, fairly easy, but it will be featured, Beloved, heavily on the final exam because we have spent, you know, several weeks on it. So I will, in our review session for the final, mention this video again as a good place to go to kind of make sure that the things that I've talked about here will most likely be present on the final exam. Hint, hint. So I hope that helps. I have, like I said, lots of assignments, but I have pretty clear instructions on there for them of when everything's due. Just quickly, for right now, today's Friday, so you have another week. And what I have due for you on that day is a quiz. It's 15 questions, 15 minutes. I accidentally forgot to put a timer on the first Beloved quiz, so you got unlimited time. But this one is 15 questions, but 20 minutes. I'm sorry, I gave you 20 minutes on that. It's due Friday. There's a quick discussion board post due Friday that's just kind of helping you get ready to talk about the end of Beloved and talk about what your paper is going to be. And then there is a essay building assignment, identical to essay 2, the first one you did, identical to essay 1. So it'll all be easy this time because you've done it once. Then on Tuesday, so that's due Friday. Then I gave you another day on Tuesday. Essay Building 2 is due, same as Essay Building 2 with last time. The final version of your paper is due Thursday. So 2 weeks from yesterday, your paper is due. Okay, I hope that all makes sense. I have all the due dates written down if I sounded confusing there. But all right, you guys, it's raining here, and I think it's going to rain all weekend, so I'll probably just stay cuddled up at home, trying to stay dry and stay well. So hope y'all are doing great. Let me know if you have questions about anything I've said on here or any of the assignments, and we will touch base soon.